Okay, hello everyone and welcome to PHP Training. This is going to be our first session. Um, Hopefully we can avoid some of the technical difficulties we had earlier today that prevented our recording live. And this recording will be useful for everyone who wasn't able to see everything in person. So, does PHP really stand for Programming Happiness and Peace? It does if you're Ryan Bird. For the rest of us, let's continue reading to learn more about PHP. First off, a little about who we are. These subtitles may or may not be true, but Ryan Bird and I, David Merriman, are in the development department at Property Solutions, and we wanted to give everyone a little bit of background on what PHP is and how they can use it, and what it can do for them. So first off, we want this to be as interactive as possible. You only learn so much by reading, hearing, or seeing. We want you to follow along with your own coding environment so you can try out the examples and play with your own examples as we go along. And if you can do this with a group and discuss what you're learning, even better. So at the end of all of these sessions, we want you to be able to understand PHP syntax, what it looks like, flow control, expressions, and functions, understand proper object-oriented programming, to be able to read and write basic PHP code, and to know the Property Solutions coding standards, so you can write code that looks like everyone else's code and we can all understand each other. So let's talk about what PHP is. Rather than Programming Happiness and Peace, it is a recursive acronym which means PHP, Hypertext Preprocessor. It is a language that is widely used as a server-side scripting language, which means that we use it to prepare data, usually a web page, on a web server before we send it to a user's browser. It is a general-purpose programming language, which means that we can solve pretty much any problem with PHP that we could solve with another programming language. It also has very good database capabilities, and it's frequently used to manipulate all kinds of data in order to present it in an interesting and useful way to a user. So let's look at some things that we can do with PHP. Let's see, this is an example of a real-time text message voting script, which we used to do the voting for our hackathon a month or so ago. We can take images and put them on the Time Magazine Person of the Year cover. We can put the same picture on a soda can if you really want to. You can analyze a sentence, any sentence, and see whether it presents a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment. So let's say this presentation is awesome. It looks like that is either positive or neutral. I say this presentation stinks. That's either negative or neutral. So with varying degrees of success, we can classify different sentences. Finally, we can BYUify something. Let's look at what that means. Looks like we are basically going to be taking all the red out of something. So yeah, that definitely looks a lot better. Sorry for all of you Utes out there. Ryan and I are both BYU graduates, but with some PHP knowledge, Okay, so the agenda for today, we want you to be able to code immediately. So writecodeonline.com/PHP will allow you to write code directly in your browser. So if I were to do something like this, it would run immediately, and I could see my results immediately. So when you see code, Feel free to pause the presentation, put it into Write Code Online, and try it out for yourself. Play with it. Try and predict what you think will happen before you run it and see if you're right. For later on, you can install on any computer a web server with a PHP running on it, and you'll be able to code up more complicated examples than you can run on Write Code Online, and that's a great way to get started tinkering. We also want to build through starting with some simple challenges and move to some more complicated ones. We're going to start with adding 2 numbers. We're going to move on to adding lots of numbers. We didn't get time today to tackle challenge 3, hot or not. We will take care of that in session 2. Our ultimate goal is a pretty complex real-world problem, which we are calling Find the Terrorist, which is an interesting data manipulation exercise that actually has a lot of real-world applications. But before we end this session, we will give you some homework so you have something to play with on your own time, and hopefully gain some more knowledge and some more practice. So let's talk about the anatomy of a PHP script. A PHP script, and in fact all computer programs, consist of 2 pieces. We have data, and then we have instructions which operate on data. In PHP, data is represented by variables. A variable is essentially just a name associated with a stored value. For example, here we have a variable named variable, which is storing the value 42. To use and manipulate data, we write expressions involving 1 or more variables. In this case, we have another variable which is being assigned the value of whatever is in our first variable times 3. Since the first variable has the value 42, another variable is going to be 126. We use various operations to modify our variables. We're going to have more on these in a couple of slides. But the combination of variables and expressions and other statements to accomplish some goal is what constitutes a program or a script in PHP. Let's talk a little bit more about variables. So we said that variables are a placeholder for data. A variable name always starts with a $sign in PHP. It's then followed by one letter, and then 1 or more letters, numbers, or underscores. You can then assign it a value. You can change that value. You can use that value in expressions. Variables can assign various different types of data, including numbers or text consisting of 1 or more letters or spaces or whatever. The term for that in programming is a string. We can also assign variables the values of collections of data, such as a collection can consist of a combination of numbers and strings and other things. We can use various operations to add and combine our variables. We can multiply them, add them, we can increment them, we can decrement them, we can compare them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about all of those operations when we get to expressions. There's a lot of operations in PHP, and thankfully there is a website which documents all of them and how they all work together for us. Before we move on to that, let's talk about data types. In PHP, all data has a type associated with it, and that data type determines what we can and cannot do with that data. In PHP, the type of the data is tied only to the data and not to the variable. This isn't true in other languages like Java or C or C++ or C#. Those languages are called strongly typed languages because their variables also have a type associated with them. And I can't assign a value to a variable if the data types of the value and the variable don't match. In PHP, which is a loosely typed language, I can have a variable which starts as a number, and later on I assign it a string, and later on I assign it an array. It's up to the programmer to know what data is in the variable when I try and use it, so that I can use operations that are appropriate for that data type. PHP tries to be very robust and just do the right thing with your data, but it can sometimes get confused if, for example, you tried to multiply two strings together. That operation may not make sense. Some examples of data types that we have. An int or integer is a number with no fractional part. A float is a number that may or may not have a fraction. Floats can generally be a lot larger than integers as well. A Boolean is a very simple data type, which is either true or false. Those are the only possible values. A string is a collection of 0 or more characters of any sort, basically just text. An array is a collection of multiple pieces of data, and those pieces of data can be of any type, and they don't have to match each other. So in an array, which we'll probably cover a little more in depth in later sessions, but you will have basically a list of data, and they will have keys that point to each different data type. And finally, we have objects, which are also a collection of different pieces of data, but there's also code associated with it. Objects allow us to kind of model real-world objects, such as a person or a vehicle, with the data that describes them, and also the code which models the behaviors that those objects can accomplish. We're not going to go over objects in this presentation, but keep that in mind, because that's something that we want to be building towards. So let's talk about expressions. Expressions are a combination of values, variables, operations, and function calls to produce some desired result. We have logical operators that we can use to reason about whether expressions are true or false. Operations are executed in a very specific order. That's going to be the subject of our first little exercise here. The question is, what will this statement print? If you go to this link, this is PHP's operator precedence table. The way this works is that operators that are at the top of the list have precedence over operators that are lower on the list. For example, multiplication and division have higher precedence over addition and subtraction. So PHP is going to do all of these operations in an expression first. Later it will evaluate these, and so on down the list. If there are two different operators on the same row, we have to look at the associativity. So if an operator is left associative, that means we're going to evaluate these operators from left to right in the expression. Most operators are left associative. There are a few that are right associative, such as these shortcut assignment operators, which are right associative. That means we evaluate them from right to left. So here we have our expression. We're going to see what we think this will print. So take a minute, think about it, and when you think you know what it's going to do, you can come over here to Write Code Online, and let's just put that expression in. It's 4 minus 3 divided by 3 times 2 plus 1. So let's run that, and we get the answer of 3. So let me just show you how that breaks down and how we're evaluating this. So this is our initial expression. On the operator precedence table, the highest precedence operator here is the divide and the multiply, which are on the same level. Those operations are left associative, so that means we're going to do the division first. So that means that that statement will be first broken down to this. So we substitute the 3 divide 3 with 1. The next highest precedence operator is the multiplication. So we can substitute these right here are called comments. They're a way that we can put some nice English so we can understand a little bit about what our code is doing. They're very helpful because a lot of times we program something and then we come back to it 6 months later and we don't know what we did. If you have comments in there, it'll help you understand it a lot faster. So here I'm substituting 1 times 2 for 2. Next up, we have subtraction and addition. Those are the same precedence, but it's left associative, so we're going to take care of the subtraction first. So we have 2 plus 1. And that's because 4 minus 2 equals 2. And finally, we only have one operation left. And the result of that operation is 3. So this, I've kind of done by hand what PHP is doing behind the scenes. It's just gradually going through these operations one by one until it gets down to its final result. So hopefully that will help you understand a little bit about how expressions work and how PHP evaluates different operations. It's important to note that while code like this might get us the right answer, it was a little difficult for us to figure it out. We had to look at the operator precedence table and kind of do some mental arithmetic to figure out exactly what was going on here. And generally we want to write code that is immediately understandable. So in this case, even though they're not necessary, we might consider adding some spaces or some parentheses or some comments, even though they may not be necessary, just so that we can understand what's going on a little bit better. It's a good practice to follow with any kind of complicated code, so that someone else, or maybe even yourself later on down the road, can understand better what's going on. So let's go to challenge number 1. What we want to do in this challenge is assign 5 to one variable, 7 to another variable, and then add them together and print out the result. Now would be a good time to switch over to writecodeonline/PHP and try this yourself. Try and do it at first without looking, and then compare the code that you have to what we have here. And see how close you got and what you did differently. One thing that's always true about programming is that there are multiple ways to solve a problem. So just because your code looks different doesn't mean it's wrong. So looking at our code here, on this first line we have an assignment of 5 to operator 1. We have assignment of 7 to operator 2. We're adding them together and storing the result in a variable called result. And then we're doing this echo statement. And these double quotes, when you put double quotes around something, that's a string. There's something special going on in our echo statement. This is called string interpolation. And when you echo a string that is encased in double quotes like this, PHP will find operator names such as operator 1, operator 2, and result, and will replace those names, those variable names, with the value of that variable. So let's go ahead and take this code and see if it does what we want. If I run that, sure enough, 5 plus 7 equals 12, which was exactly what I would have expected. All right. So another operation that we might want to try out is how to combine strings. So I will show you another operation that we can use to accomplish that. So let's say I have a name. Let's say James. And I want to say hi to James. So I'll say this dot operator is called the string concatenation operator. It basically glues strings end to end. So name happens to be a string, so I can use the dot operator there. And then I can say, how are you? And when I run this, we'll see that these three different values, which are strings, are all stuck together end to end to form one statement. So those are just a taste of some of the operations we can do with expressions and operators in PHP. Okay, so feel free to try some of those things out and get a feel for those basic operations. And when you're ready, we can continue on with looping. Sometimes we need to do the same thing multiple times, or we need to do the same thing to multiple pieces of data. Loops are the answer to all of these situations. We have 4 different kinds of loops in PHP. We have a while loop, which will execute the same piece of code until a certain condition is met. What that means is that this is the condition right here, x is less than 10. And then the code in between the curly braces is the code which will be executed every time through the loop. The do while loop is exactly like the while, except the test comes second, meaning we execute the loop body first, and then we evaluate the condition. If the condition is false, we stop the loop. If it's true, we go back and do the loop body again. For loop loops over a set number of iterations. It has 3 sections. The first is the initializer, which usually is used to set up our count variable. Then we have the loop condition, which, like in the while and do while loop, is used to evaluate whether we should continue looping. And then we have the incrementer, which is used to change the value of our count variable. And of course we have the loop body, which is executed every time we iterate over the loop. Finally, we have a for each loop, which loops over all the items of an array or a list. So first I put the array or list, then the keyword as, and then I give a temporary variable, which I use to hold the current item that this iteration is operating on. And then in my code, I would use the student variable to do something with that value. So let's go over a couple of questions. First off, what do you think would happen in our example while loop if we never modified x within the loop body? So think about that for a second. The answer is that if, assuming that x is less than 10 to begin with, we will get into the loop body and x will never change, so the loop will never exit. And you've just written an infinite loop which will never terminate. And when I say never, I mean never until either PHP runs out of memory or you kill it because it's taking too long. Usually PHP scripts have a timeout, so it will kill itself after a certain amount of time without a response. But that's something to always watch out for. You always need to be modifying something about your loop condition within a while loop body. Same thing with a do while. If we don't modify x inside this loop body, then our condition will always be true. Another question to think about, what happens if x is 20 immediately before executing this while loop? The answer is that the loop body will actually never be executed because the condition evaluates to false on the first try, so we terminate the loop before we've ever executed the loop body. If instead we try that same thing with the do while, the loop body would execute exactly once. Another question that we should think about is, can we accomplish the same thing with one type of loop as we would with another loop? For example, could I do the same thing with a for loop as with the while loop? So let's write a for loop which prints out all the numbers between 1 and 10. We run that, and there we go. Notice that because the condition is x is less than 10, we didn't actually get 10 on there. Change this to let's see, x is less than or equal to 10, and we'll get 10. So how do we do that with a while loop? Well, let's start with our basic while loop pattern. We're going to initialize the counter outside the while loop. We're going to have the exact same condition. We're going to have the same loop body. The only difference is we're going to have the incrementer at the bottom of the while loop body. One thing I'm doing here, which is useful, is that x++ is basically shorthand for x equals x plus 1. So we're adding 1 to x and then assigning the value back into x. For various reasons, it's always good to have this basically on its own line and not used in any larger part of expressions. We can go in, there's more details on that if you look at the slideshow for this presentation. Just know that you'll want to keep that on its own line in most cases. So let's run this and see if it does the same thing. Oh, look at that, I made a bug. I'll run that again, and you can see that this is where our original input stopped, and this is where the new one began, and it's the same. So this while loop is equivalent to this for loop. And you can basically accomplish anything with one type of loop as you can with any other type of loop. All right, so let's go on to challenge number 2, where we're going to add lots of numbers. Let's write code that will add all the numbers between 1 and 100. The challenge here is if we can do it with every different kind of loop. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to start with a for loop just because that's what I've got here. I'm going to start at 1. I want to go to 100 and I want to include 100. I'm going to go by 1 each time. I need a variable to store my total. So total equals 0. And in my loop body, I'm going to say total plus equals x. This plus equals operator is similar to the plus plus operator. Basically what it means is it's shorthand for total equals total plus x. So let's echo my total. And you can do the math yourself if you want, or you can just trust me and know that 50-50 is the right answer in this case. So that's how we do it with the for loop. Let's try a while loop. So for a while, we're going to start with a total of 0. We're also going to need a counter variable, which we're going to start at 1. And we're going to say x is less than or equal to 100. The loop body is basically going to be the same. And I always need to make sure to change my loop condition and use the right variable names. So let's run that, and we do indeed get the same result as we would have expected. Let's try a do while. We're going to use the same basic setup here. With a do while loop, the loop body comes before the loop condition, so we're going to put that here. It's going to be exactly the same as the while loop. We're going to have the exact same condition. Let's echo the total. And it looks like we get the same answer. Now we'll do a for each loop. Now the for each loop, we're going to have a little bit of a problem because all of the numbers need to come from an array. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to be lazy and I'm just going to stop typing there. And you'll just have to trust me that if I typed it all the way out to 100, it would do the same thing. Let's set the total to 0 first. Total plus equals number. And then let's echo the total again. So, if this one works, we should get an answer of 15. And we did. So, in this case, we can see that for each isn't exactly ideal for this kind of situation, but if you were patient enough to type out all those numbers, it would definitely work. Okay, so we did it with all the different types of loops, but now the question is there a better way? And to answer that question, let's talk a little bit about Carl Friedrich Gauss, a famous mathematician. The story goes that when he was a little child, he was asked by a teacher who either was punishing him or wanted to get the students out of their hair for a little while to add up all the numbers between 1 and 100. He quickly came up with the answer that we've been getting from our loops, but without having to go through and add all of them one by one. And the reason he was able to do that is because he had derived this formula that you see on the second line of this slide. N times n plus 1 over 2 gives you the sum of all numbers between 1 and n. So let's go and code that up ourselves in PHP and see if that gives us the right answer. So we will say n equals 100. We will echo n times n plus 1 divided by 2. And we do indeed get the right answer. So what that shows us is that while there are many correct ways to code this up, and there will be many ways to get a correct answer in any problem you're solving with PHP or any programming language. But as you can imagine, if we were trying to add up all the numbers between 1 and a million, using this formula would be significantly faster than using any of our loop solutions. It's something we always want to keep in mind in computer science and programming. Is not just did we get the right answer, but did we get there in the best possible way. Especially at property solutions, when we sometimes deal with large amounts of data, we need to make sure that the way we are doing things will scale well as our problem gets larger. All right, let's talk about control flow and making decisions. So sometimes we need to execute different code depending on what our data is. And we have two tools at our disposal. There's if statements, which also have else clauses and else if, which will execute different code based on the value of a test expression. And we have switch statements, which are similar to if statements, but they can be faster in certain conditions. And basically, if your test expression is always comparing some expression to different constants, then you use a switch. The best way to visualize these is to just look at them. So let's dive into some code. So here what I'm doing is I'm generating a random number between 0 and 10. And I'm assigning it to var. And then I'm printing out different things depending on what the value of var actually is. So if var is 1, then I'm going to print var is 1. That's what this first condition is telling me. This double equals is testing for equality, as opposed to the single equals, which is doing an assignment. So if var is 1, then I'm going to fall into this case. If this expression evaluates to false, which would happen if var is anything other than 1, then we're going to go and look for an else case, and we find it right here. And then we'll execute what comes immediately after the else, which happens to be another if. So this is a slightly more complicated condition, which is basically saying is var between 1 and 5 exclusive, so 2, 3, or 4. If that happens, then we'll echo this line. If it's not in between this range, then we're going to go look for another else case, which we find here. And I'll leave it to you to think about, what cases we're going to fall into here. Whenever we're writing conditionals, we want to make sure that we know we've covered all of our cases. We know all the cases that we're going to come across, and we can say with confidence what's happening in each one. So in this case, we can say that var is either greater than or equal to 5 or it's 0, because we could get 0 out of our random number generator. And so this is basically how an if statement would work. And if you want to, you can take that code, put it into Write Code Online, and test it out for yourself, maybe play with some of the numbers. One important thing here, at Property Solutions, we have a convention of putting our constants on the left side of an equals as opposed to on the right side. And this looks a little backwards to the way we normally think of things. And the reason that we do this is sometimes as programmers, we might make some mistakes. So let me illustrate this for you. Let's say var is 5. And then I do var is equal to 1. Then I say var is 1. Else var is not 1. If I run that, it runs just fine. It says var is not 1. Well, let's say I made a typo and I just left 1 equals there. When I run that, I get var is 1. Well, how can that be? The reason is I'm not doing an equality test here. I'm doing an assignment. And so what happens is PHP assigns 1 into var. And then the result of that statement, which is 1, is tested to see whether it's true or false. In PHP, any number that is not 0 is considered true. And so since this evaluates to true, we fall into this case and we say var is 1. And in fact it is, because we assigned it to be 1. It's an easy error to make, and it's a really hard error to catch. If you were to write that instead this way, you get an error. And that's a lot easier to catch than, because errors are very obvious what's going on. It tells you on line 2 you have a syntax error because you can't assign a value to a constant. That's a lot easier to catch than just say, oh, well, my program is not working the way I expected it to. So at Property Solutions, we've adopted the convention to put the constant on the left-hand side so we get errors instead of bad logic. Here is an example of a switch statement. So the way a switch statement works is this switch statement is designed to be basically equivalent to the if statement we had earlier. So you have some expression which you're testing, which you put here. And what PHP will do is it'll figure out the value of this expression and will compare that value to the different cases that you have given. And it will go, and as soon as it finds a case that matches, it will begin executing the code right below that case. And it will continue executing code until it hits either a break or a return, or it gets to the end of the switch statement, which is down here. So another thing you'll notice is that here we have cases 2, 3, and 4 all stacked on top of each other. This is a nice way where if we have several different cases that all have the same behavior, we only have to write that behavior one time instead of duplicating it several times. If you have kind of a catch-all case, similar to our else case here at the bottom, in the switch statement you do that with a default. And for those of you who were paying attention when I was describing how a switch statement executes, will notice that we have a little bug here. We don't have a break statement here at the bottom of this case. And I did that for a reason. That's to show you that if I executed this code the way it was, and actually let's just go do that. So let's say switch on var, case 1, echo var is 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, echo var is between 1 and 5, and default, and we say about var here. So that's our code example. In this case, let's set var equal to 2. Now you'll notice that we executed this line, and then we also executed the next line, and both of those printed. And the reason is because we didn't have a break statement. And the way a switch executes is it finds the case that matches, which would be 2, and then it will execute the next line. So this line doesn't do anything, this line doesn't do anything. This line prints out, and then it will continue to go until it hits either a break or the end of the switch. And that's why we executed all that code. You will almost always want to have a break statement at the end of all of your different cases to prevent that what's called fall-through execution behavior. There are rare cases when it's actually useful, and your homework will probably actually be one of those situations, but in general you're going to want to always make sure you have break statements when you're using a switch. Okay, these few slides are things we're going to cover in our next session because we are about out of time, as well as this challenge and our main goal to do some big data exercises. So let's talk about our homework. The first problem is that you are feeling festive. It's Christmas time and you want to use your PHP skills to show off your Christmas spirit. So we want you to use a for loop and a switch statement and write a PHP script that prints out the entire lyrics of the 12 Days of Christmas. However, it's important to know that you're a programmer now, and programmers are lazy. That's why we write programs to do things for us. So you need to write your script without duplicating any of the lyrics. It would be really easy to just have an echo statement for every line. But using a for loop and a switch statement, you can actually do this without copying and pasting a whole bunch of song lyrics. As a hint, I will say that your switch statement probably won't have break statements in it, and your for loop will probably be looping over the verses of the song. And if you don't know the lyrics to the 12 Days of Christmas, in the slides of this presentation you should be able to find a link that takes you to the Wikipedia page for the song that gives you the lyrics. Second homework is to install a WAMP server on your machine. WAMP stands for Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And there are various software packages which will take care of all the installation of all of those and configuring them for you. So if you get the slides, click on that link and you'll be taken to a list of software packages that will do that for you. And the reason we want you to do that is because Write Code Online is fairly limited as to the size of projects that you can be working on there. And if you really want to get learning PHP and start doing your own tinkering on your own time, having your own server is going to be very important for that. So that's a fun project that can really get you going on some of your own tinkering as far as code goes. So to test your knowledge, we have a quick quiz. So question 1, why do we place literals to the left of an expression? Question 2, what is the difference between for and for each? Question 3, what is the purpose of the break statement in a switch statement? And question 4, when might you use a do-while loop instead of a while loop? Now the answers to these questions, for question 1, we place a literal to the left of an expression so that we can avoid typos that create bad logic and can be very difficult bugs to track down. We prefer to have errors we prefer to have what are called compile time errors, which is where your script will not run because it is incorrect, rather than logic errors where it runs but just produces the wrong result. The compile time errors are much easier to track down. Question 2, what is the difference between a for and a for each? A for loop will iterate over a specified set of iterations using an initializer, a condition, and an incrementer. A for each loop is used to iterate over a list or an array. Question number 3, what is the purpose of the break statement in a switch statement? The break statement is used to end execution of a case. If you don't have break statements, your cases will fall through into the next case below them. You use a break so that you can terminate execution of the loop when you're done with a case. And question 4, when might you use a do-while loop instead of a while loop? Well, a do-while loop, you are always guaranteed to execute the loop body at least once before you ever try to execute the loop test. So with a while loop, you usually always have to kind of prime the pump and get your loop condition and that sort of thing set up before the first time you run the loop. If you know there's always going to be something you do in the loop body that will always happen regardless of the condition, you might consider a do-while loop. However, they are fairly uncommon. Finally, we wanted to leave you with some resources. PHP.net is the official webpage for PHP, and it is a wealth of information about all the different built-in language features and functions that you can use. Code Academy has a PHP section that will give you tutorials similar to this and allow you to code in the browser and see your results immediately. So it can be very useful. Zento also has some PHP slides which will help you get acquainted with web technology and where PHP fits into the puzzle. We also have some slides on Property Solutions PHP coding standards. W3 Schools has some PHP tutorials, and so does TIZAG. So if you're ready for more information before our next session, be sure to check those out. I hope you have learned a lot about PHP, and we look forward to seeing you in our next session.